It was the first time that I was a messenger of death. I was a first-year pastor, and our home telephone rang in the early evening. The caller told me that there had been the unexpected death of a man on the other side of the country and asked if I would go and inform his adult daughter about what had happened. The church was small, the town was small. I had a pretty good idea where she probably was, at the home of some friends of this young couple. And so I drove over to the friend's house. It was getting dark, and I prayed all the way because I just didn't know how to do this. I didn't know what to say or how to say it. When I arrived, I knocked at the front door, and the host of the home was, of course, surprised to see me. And my very being there was an indicator that I was probably a bearer of bad news. I asked if the couple was there and if I could speak to them alone. And we went into a little room, and I sat down and told her that her dad had just died. And as I told her, I struggled to deal with my own emotions, to choke back the tears that were ready to flow. It was a few months later that the daughter's husband told me that I'm not very good at death notifications. And perhaps that was a criticism. I think it was meant to be that. But actually, I took it as something of a compliment because I decided it's something I didn't want to be good at. I don't want to be really good at telling people that there has been the surprise death of someone that they deeply care about. I decided that I always want that to be a very hard thing to do. The Old Testament book of 1 Samuel ends with the battlefield deaths of Israel's King Saul and Prince Jonathan and two other sons of the king. The sons were killed by enemy swords. The king himself was mortally wounded by enemy arrows, and fearing that he would be captured and tortured and humiliated by the Philistines, he decided that it was better to take his own life. And so on the slope of Mount Gilboa, King Saul committed suicide. Meanwhile, David and his men were miles away. They had been exempted from that particular battle, but they had had a battle of their own. They had, after 3 days' journey, come back to their homes in Ziklag to find that they had been pretty much burned to the ground, and the terrorists, Amalekites, had come in and stolen their wives and children and families and possessions. And the intent apparently was to keep all of their possessions and to sell their families at some Middle Eastern slave market. But God had intervened. God had directed David and 400 of his 600 men to exactly where the Amalekite camp was located, and they were able to recover all of their possessions, but far more important, all of their family members, and return them to Ziklag. And so it was a day of delight, and still a day of dismay, because their homes had all been destroyed. And then came the messenger of death. It's the opening lines of the Old Testament book of 2 Samuel. After the death of Saul, David returned from defeating the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the third day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and with dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. "Where have you come from?" David asked him. He answered, "I've escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened?" David asked. "Tell me." He said, "The men fled from the battle. Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Then David and the young man who brought him said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, the young man said, and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the chariots and riders almost upon him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me and said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered. Then he said to me, 'Stand over me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive.' So I stood over him and killed him because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm and have brought them here to my Lord." David loved King Saul. And David loved Prince Jonathan. Even though the king had declared David a criminal, even though he put a price on his head, even though he had tried to kill him himself, David was still loyal to the king. Even though he and Jonathan had been separated by war and politics and circumstances, they were still the best of friends. To be sure, there is no good way to tell anyone that someone loved has died. But this messenger, he couldn't have gotten it much worse. First of all, he was an Amalekite. And David considered Amalekites to be all terrorists. They had just taken his family and possessions. He had pursued them. He was standing, when he received this message, right in the middle of a community of burned down houses. And this guy's an Amalekite. You got to know that David was prejudiced against him before he ever opened his mouth. And the messenger completely misjudged David's response to the news that he brought. He assumed that David would be glad that King Saul was dead because he thought that King Saul was David's enemy. He assumed that David would immediately become the king of Israel, which he did not. He assumed that David would be thrilled that Jonathan was also dead because that would be one less impediment to his own rising to the throne. He could not have been more wrong. David was loyal to the king. He loved the prince as his best friend, and he was shocked to the point of dismay with the news of these deaths. It's a vivid lesson to us all to remember that we should be very slow to assume what people think and how they feel when they go through grief. It's too easy a thing for us to put our story into their story, to feed our emotions into what we assume to be their emotions. Because the truth is that everyone grieves differently. So don't be like the Amalekites. Don't misunderstand the heartbreak of David and of his men. And then this Amalekite messenger lied in order to make himself look good, because he hadn't killed King Saul at all. Saul had taken his own life. And so his misjudgment of David's grief and his own selfish ambition that somehow he was going to get a reward for killing the king, it combined together to make him into a fool. This Amalekite messenger of death messed up big time, and yet his foolishness was actually used for good. Because when he somehow came across the body of the dead King Saul, he stole from him the crown on his head and the royal band that was around his arm. He took them to David on the assumption that David would immediately become the next king of Israel. David was to become the next king of Israel, but it would take years of civil war before that would actually happen. He was God's choice, but not yet. It wasn't quite ready to happen. And what this Amalekite did was present the crown and the armband to David in this amazing twist of events, that the first person to openly acknowledge that David was God's choice to become the king of Israel was this pagan, heathen, thieving, lying, terrorist Amalekite. Because God has this extraordinary way of taking even the foolishness and the sins of others and bringing them together in ways that we could never anticipate or predict. The crown, it was not yet on David's head, But it was now in David's hand. The messenger must have been totally shocked when he saw and heard the response of David and his men. David and his mini army of 600, they did not rejoice and celebrate. Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. Grief is like a freight train. None of us can predict how we're going to react. We may think we can. We may say that when that freight train hits us, we know exactly what we will say and do, but we do not. There are some of us, when grief comes, we withdraw away into silence and aloneness. There are others of us that when we grieve, we just lash out against anybody and everybody who is even close. Some of us act out in ways that we can't even remember what we said or did 6 months later. Sometimes we're shocked at the reports of people about our own behavior. David and his men tore their clothes. They wept and they groaned in anguish. They couldn't eat. They were so upset. And they had a lot to mourn. Their nation had been defeated. Their army had been devastated. Their king was dead. Their leader's best friend was gone. It was a total shock, a horrific loss. And they grieved. Of course they grieved. Grief is such strange stuff. It catches you by surprise. Just when you think you're doing fine, when you're pretty much okay, maybe you've even decided you're over it, it sneaks up behind you and just slams you across your head. And then there are other times when you say, I just can't go on. I just can't do this. Only to discover that you have a strength, a fortitude, a stamina that you just never knew was even in you. And so David, who is weeping and groaning and refusing to eat, stopped crying. And he stood up as a military officer and as a political leader. David said to the young man who brought him the report, "Where are you from?" "I'm the son of an alien, an Amalekite," he answered. David asked him, "Why were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of his men and said, "Go strike him down." So he struck him down and he died. For David had said to him, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" And so David did what a lot of people do in grief. He lashed out against the messenger. He was so angry, he was so grieved that he lashed out against whoever was there. And who was there in front of him was this Amalekite who reported that he had killed King Saul. It's true that David was not yet officially the king, but he was well on his way to the throne. It would take a few more years, but on that day, David began to exercise one of the prerogatives of royalty, and that is capital punishment. It must have seemed to David like an easy verdict and a simple sentence to give, because the messenger was an Amalekite. And as far as David was concerned, Amalekites were all terrorists who raided and murdered and stole. Besides that, he had a confession. David repeated it. "Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" And what does any judge or jury ever need more than a confession with lots of witnesses, including them? David and his men had heard the confession right out loud. Except he didn't do it. He lied. It was a foolish and a false confession. And that day, David executed an innocent man. Real life is seldom simple or easy. Real life is just messy stuff. Totally guilty people protest their guilt and say they are innocent with an astonishing credibility. But they're also totally innocent people who amazingly say they are guilty and confess to things that they had never done. And David in his grief jumped to an obvious but a tragic conclusion. And it was a mistake that he never should have made, and a mistake that we must not make. Certainly we must try not to make, that in the upset of the moment, in the emotion of what we don't like or the anger when we want to lash out, it is way too easy to take a few facts and somehow multiply them out into what seems to be a clear and an obvious conclusion and make a terrible mistake that later we will regret. So in this, at least, don't be like David. Please, don't kill the messenger. Recently, I read the advice of a Christian grief counselor. She said, I urge those who are grieving to review their loss, talk about it openly, think about it thoroughly, write about it reflectively, and pray through it. She added, it's my experience that people want to run from their pain. They want to replace pain with another feeling as soon as they can. To recover from pain, they have to face it. You must stand in it and process it before it will dissipate. That is God's way. And that is what David finally did. He wrote a poem, a lyric poem, a song, the tune to the song as well. And he taught that song to his men and to their families and insisted that they sing it. In those days, it was called not a song, but a psalm. And although 72 of the 150 psalms in the Old Testament book by that name are attributed to David, this one was never actually inserted into the book of Psalms, but it is one that David wrote. David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan and ordered that the men of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jasher. Your glory, O Israel, lies slain on your heights. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. O mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain, nor fields that yield offerings of grain. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and gracious. And in death, they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. O daughters of Zion, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished. So these are the words of a man who is grieving from every angle. David compared what was to what is. How the mighty are fallen. He who is king and on his throne, he who is filled with the Spirit, he who is leading Israel as God's people, he's gone. He's no more. David writes that he wants to keep this a secret from the enemy. Not that that was possible, But he doesn't want the story told in the streets of the Philistine cities of Gath and Ashkelon. He doesn't want their women celebrating over the death of those that he loved. Don't tell them. Don't let them find out, because how can we stand it if they celebrate something that is so terrible and so awful? And then he fantasizes that the mountain where Saul and Jonathan died, Mount Gilboa, may the rain not fall there. May grain not grow there. How can that place ever go back to the way it used to be? How could that be sort of a curse on the place, because that's where they died? And he yearns that they be remembered well. There was plenty to not remember well, but David doesn't mention that. He says that they were loved and that they were gracious. And he does something I think most of us do when those that we love are lost. We kind of scramble for any little detail in which we might find comfort. And David found comfort that Saul and Jonathan, at least father and son, had died together, side by side. And David, in his song, declares with vigor his love for Jonathan. Not a sexual love, as some modern interpreters have tried to impose upon this Old Testament writing, but rather the closest of bonds between two men who are the best of friends. So, David's words, are they rational? Should we consider them to be literal? Of course not. These are not the cold words of a coroner's report. These are the emotions of a man who is in the throes of grief. This is someone who is mourning for those that he deeply loved. David's grief was deep and painful. But as we turn the pages forward into his biography, we discover that he healed and he went on. And we want to ask him, how did you do that? How do you do that when you lose a friend or a business partner or a mom or a dad or a brother or a sister or a mentor or a protege or a child? How do you go on? And David would answer us and say that those who grieve deeply and who trust God are those who can hold the best of memories from yesterday and the best of hope for tomorrow. I recall a story I've told before of a pastor who faced perhaps the most indescribable loss that anyone could ever face when his son committed suicide. It was 10 days later that he stood before the congregation that he served, and he preached a sermon based on Romans 8:28. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. That pastor stood there in the midst of his own grief, and he said that he could not fit his son's death into this verse. He could not find any good in what had happened. And then he said, it's like the miracle of the shipyard. Almost every part of our great ocean-going vessels are made of steel. If you take any single part, be it a steel plate out of the hull or the huge rudder, and throw it into the ocean, it will sink. Steel doesn't float. But when the shipbuilders are finished, when the last plate has been riveted in place, when the massive steel ship is then going, it is virtually unsinkable. Taken by itself, my son's suicide is senseless. Throw it into the sea of Romans 8:28, and it sinks. Still, I believe that when the eternal shipbuilder has finally finished, When God has worked out his perfect design, even this senseless tragedy will somehow work to our eternal good. Like David, like this father, when we experience the greatest losses of life, grieve deeply and trust. Grieve deeply for those lost and trust fully for the God of tomorrow. And so we shall, by your grace, our Lord, acknowledge that there are some losses in life for which there are no words of description. There are some emotions that are so deep that we can't even tell someone what it's like. But we take the counsel of your word and the promise of your Son. We grieve deeply and trust fully. In Jesus' name.